Travels of the Ellis Arbor is an audio narrative set in the world of Bastion using 5e compatible characters. A dark fantasy world with chaos, intrigue, magic, and mystery. The story, setting, and sounds are written by Lonomy and published by lonomy.creative. Tune in for episode 4, Sanctuary. Between cracked shingles and scattered cobblestones, Darian, Ed, Moore, Nout, and Carpathian made haste toward the exterior gates of the briny ward, the quarter guard hot on their tails. As bolts flew, steel clashed, plate chimed, and bells tolled, they scattered as pirates are wont to do, breaking their pursuers into factions, dissipating them throughout the corridors between steeples. One column barely managed to keep a bead on Darian and Carpathian. The deftness with which the captain bore his speed was immeasurable. Through overturned carts, amidst barrels and baskets, the captain stayed his pursuers with ease, as he had done so many times before. At his heels, he dragged the now bound and sluggish form of Carpathian, barely keeping step with his staff at his hip and his heels dragging along the scattered and broken debris of the side streets. Away to the southern side of the road, Ed had mounted the engorged, wild-shaped form of Moore, barreling through the walls of each stone tower. From this vantage, Ed could simply pick off any guard that dared too close. His arcane rifle shattering through the whip of dust and stone, cascading through streets and sending armor clanging toward the roadside. A more brutish and audacious approach to flight compared to the finesse of the captain. Toward the gate, the lone artificer stood aloft, his floating mechanical disc keeping him several feet above the air. With a whip of his hand and a flourish of arcane sigils, the stones that littered the streets began to dance at Nout's command. Wherever and whenever an attacker stood bravely in his presence, they were quickly hailed by an assault of debris, pot-marking and denting their armor, and sending them reeling and clutching at their helmets. Between a dance, a clash, and a storm, the crew of the Ellis Arbor kept their weary aggressors at bay, funneling them through the now open portcullis as they fled toward their sanctuary. The Abbey, they had heard it called, an abandoned lighthouse, turned place of worship for pagans and perhaps scholars alike. They knew not what awaited them, but within a short jog, they would reach the threshold of this decrepit temple. As they had been told, the Abbey was not within the jurisdiction of the wardens of the city, and thus would provide a reprieve from the disharmony that had been shown them thus far. Farreach, as they now knew, lacked a certain hospitality. Rounding the corner, onto the greying sands with which they were somewhat accustomed, Ed spied the tower in the middle distance. Almost white against the dappled landscape, it indeed resembled a pillar. A lighthouse that had been long since abandoned for the pyres upon the walls of the city, though its striking resemblance was anything but stout, for the lighthouse sunk at an obvious, awkward angle, turning toward the ocean shore. It was almost as if it had begun to sink back into the depths of Var Elamora. Pointing, shouting, carousing, they continued dragging their feet through the sands and onward toward the Abbey. Though, just as hope seemed to cloud their thoughts, they were met with another foreboding sense of threat. Vaulting over the towers and rappelling down its surface, two heavily clad individuals in a brilliant cerulean garb made for the base of the tower. The armor and weaponry evoked a much more regal, commission-like party. With power, they strode upon the beach and brought their heavy silver glaives to bear. These knights of unknown origin now stood between the crew and their sanctuary. In a moment, the captain began to bark his commands, the crew responding in tow.
"More, this is your business. Cut us a path."
At these words, the Myconid behemoth laid his human cargo to the ground, Ed trailing off behind Darian. And with a roar and a triumphant burst of wind, Moore pulled from the air around him, coalescing vibrant beads of red-hot energy. These spores that danced over his body began to glow ever brighter as his wordless chants gave power to a spell. From his body, the red spores danced and plunged deep into the sands beneath their feet. And from where the spores entered, stones, roots, burrs, and branches began to burst forth, breaking the surface and rocketing toward their newest adversaries. At once, beneath their feet, a thatched ground of brambles and shale began to encompass the knights, turning their heels, breaking their armor, and entrapping them where they stood. Crying in pain, their weapons clattered to the ground as they now reached for the vine growth, hoping to free themselves of the prison that Moore had conjured for them. And with that same knowing deftness, Darian slipped the hammer from his belt, turning it at a broad angle, and struck the first knight on the side of the helmet. His form drooping to the side as the vines encompassed him. And Carpathian, with renewed vigor, brought his hands to his side. And in one shocking movement, he drew the sword at his belt. Instead of gleaming steel, the pitch-black stone of the aged gladius appeared almost as if crumbling rock, obsidian that contrasted against the bleached sands. And with a single-minded swipe, he tore through the air, cleaving the head from the knight's shoulders. A spray of crimson and a roar of violent pleasure met with the gasps and displeasure of the remainder of the crew. They could not dwell on what had occurred. The murder of a pious knight would mean nothing if their pursuers would cut them down before they reached the Abbey. And so they pressed on, clearing the remaining beach twixt them and their freedom. It was Nout who reached the stone threshold first, placing his hand against the enormous stone doors. He pushed and budged, but it gave none. Was the door locked? How could they enter? One by one, the crew pressed upon the doorframe, pushing with all their might, but it would not give an inch. Ever closer, their pursuers came, yet the entrance to the Abbey remained steadfast, unforgiving. One by one, at a distance of no more than 30 feet, the Abbey was surrounded. No less than 36 men, armed with crossbows and javelins, donning a grimace of fierce and poignant hatred toward the crew that had evaded them. Each stood ready, their weapons drawn upon the crew, as Moore continued to batter against the unmoving door. A glamour of murderous intent met the crew as their backs were firmly placed upon the doors of the reclusive Abbey. Travels of the Ellis Arbor is made possible by the generous support of our subscribers, followers, and most notably, our patrons. Thanks to Rob Jenkin, Nathan Ebley, and Ben Vale for supporting us so far on this journey. Please subscribe, give a like or a comment, follow us on Twitter, and stay tuned for the next episode. Don't forget, take care of each other.